3 months ago, I received the news that my uncle had died. We had never been particularly close, but in his will it turned out that he had left me one of his houses. This was unexpected and even touching, although my first thought was to simply sell it. I didn't need any additional worries right now, especially since I had just become a father of twins. To speed up the sale, I decided to travel across the country and live in the house temporarily. My job allowed me to work remotely. All I needed was a laptop and a home. My wife, unfortunately, had to stay at home due to her work responsibilities, so I went alone. At first, I saw it as a kind of vacation. I thought it would be over in a week, but the process took longer than I expected. Although the realtor took care of most of the work, after a month I was still in that house. It started with little things that gave me a strange feeling. I noticed that things didn't stay where I left them. I would catch glimpses of shadows that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and time seemed to slip through my fingers. I attributed it to fatigue and loneliness. Apart from a few visits from the realtor with potential buyers, the house was almost too quiet. Its calmness was even frightening. Eventually, a neighbor decided to visit me. She was an elderly woman who brought the golden retriever, Buster, with her. She explained that she had been taking care of him while my uncle was in the hospital and decided that the dog should stay with me now. She must have been confused because she was sure that my uncle had died just a week ago. I quickly fell in love with Buster. His company was exactly what I needed. He even seemed like the perfect future gift for my dogs. However, I noticed that the dog avoided the second floor. I thought it was even convenient because it was easier to keep an eye on him. One day, Buster disappeared. One moment he was there when I was getting him treats, and the next he was nowhere to be found. I searched the whole house, called his name in every corner, but the dog was not there. I even walked around the neighborhood before finally giving up and returning home. As soon as I opened the door, I heard Buster scrabbling with his paws from the kitchen. He looked as if he hadn't gone anywhere. I let him sleep in bed with me that night to reassure myself. However, I realized now that it was a big mistake. My work was going well, and I started to forget about the strange things that were happening. There were days when I would get so caught up in phone calls and spreadsheets that I would suddenly realize it was night. My work absorbed me so much that I even began to neglect my health, forgetting to eat and sleep. Everything changed one evening. I heard the door slam upstairs. Buster immediately jumped up and ran upstairs. Although I was hesitant, I followed him, armed with the nearest frying pan. Upstairs, I saw that the bathroom door, which I remembered being closed, was now open. The lights in the corridor were out, and pulling myself together, I stepped into the pitch black of the bathroom. I was frightened to the core. What surprised me was that Buster was standing absolutely still. His tail was up, and he was staring at the bathroom door. I tried to convince myself that his calmness was a good sign, because he wasn't watching. This gave me a little courage to cross the threshold of the bathroom. The darkness in the room seemed thicker than in the corridor, but my eyes gradually began to get used to it. It was a small space, and there was clearly no place for someone to hide from. I started to relax a little, but when I took another step, I felt something sticky stuck to the soles of my shoes. Only then did I remember that I had a phone in my pocket. Taking it out, I turned on the flashlight and directed the beam to the floor. What I saw made me drop the phone from my hands. On the floor under my feet, I saw a puddle of bright red liquid that seemed to cover the entire floor. I had only one instinct left to run away. I rushed back downstairs, and Buster didn't seem to hesitate to follow. This time I didn't hesitate and immediately called the police. Luckily, a patrol car was already nearby, and within minutes 2 officers were at my house. Their powerful flashlights quickly illuminated the space. It turned out that the lights on the second floor were working properly. They went upstairs to check what had happened and found out that the bathroom floor was covered not with blood, but with water that had leaked out of the broken pipes. The water, which had stood in the pipes for years, had turned a rusty red color. I followed them, and now in the light of the lanterns I could clearly see a muddy brown puddle. It seemed that the sound I heard was just a thud due to a broken pipe. The policemen laughed a little at my panic, but were generally very friendly. They even gave me the number of a good plumber, even though my phone had broken after falling into a puddle. Now I could only use the landline in the kitchen. After the officers left, I decided to call the plumber in the morning. However, despite being tired, I could not sleep because of the incident. So I stayed at my desk working on documents for the company. At night, when I could barely stand up from exhaustion, Buster started to get rowdy in the living room again. My exhaustion got the better of me, and I lost control of myself and yelled at him. I still feel guilty about how harshly I acted then. The next morning, feeling incredibly stressed, I decided to talk to my boss. I was surprised that he supported my decision to take a week off for a psychological break. It seemed that everything I had worked so hard for no longer mattered. Without the work that usually occupied my time, I decided to focus entirely on Buster. We played. I treated him to the most delicious treats, trying to make up for my negligence and harshness. I found the first message. I didn't notice it for a long time because I avoided going upstairs. But when I finally decided to check the condition of the bathroom before calling the plumber, I saw something that made me freeze. On the wall in the corridor was written in red, "Are you crazy?" My first reaction was shock and fear. I stood there, panicked, trying to understand how it had happened. Was someone in my house? And if so, how could they have entered unnoticed? Horrifying thoughts swirled in my head that someone could have entered my home at night while I was sleeping. I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door, and quickly called the police. A few minutes later, the same officers who had come earlier were back at my house. They took my report seriously and thoroughly searched every corner of the house. They didn't find anyone. Everything was locked. There were no signs of a break-in. The officers explained that this was not the first time in the neighborhood that people had noticed strange things without finding the perpetrators. They advised me to leave my car on the street overnight to scare away possible intruders. But I had already realized that I couldn't stay here overnight. I called an old college friend of mine who lived nearby, and he agreed to come pick me and Buster up. While I was waiting, I started packing. I wanted to take everything I had brought with me, not knowing when I would be back. My friend arrived faster than I expected and called me, saying he was already waiting outside. But when I left the house, he was not there. The entrance was empty. I dialed him again, and he assured me that he was standing right in front of my house. I heard him get out of the car and walk up to the door. He even knocked, but the door was opened by an elderly woman who said she had never heard of me or my uncle. Puzzled, my friend asked me if I had the wrong address. I repeated the address and made sure it was correct. Then he asked me to go outside. When I went outside, I saw that the numbers on the curb outside my house had disappeared. Instead, the same message was written in red. "Are you crazy?" I wanted to run away immediately, but I had to go back inside to get my things and Buster. When I returned to my room, all the things I had carefully packed in my suitcase were in their places, as if I hadn't touched them at all. I focused on the main thing I had to get out of here with the dog. Buster looked exhausted, but obediently gave in when I attached the leash. I tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the bolt did not move. I felt a wave of fear again, but Buster was there. I fell to my knees and hugged him, and he licked my face as if to encourage me. Then an idea came to me. Whatever was happening, it was definitely something beyond ordinary understanding. However, I was not going to stay in that house much longer. So, despite my fear, I decided to try to get out through the backyard. I went to the glass door, and it opened easily. Buster, seizing the moment of freedom, happily ran out into the yard. His tail was wagging, and the joy on his face seemed contagious. It seemed like he hadn't been outside for a long time. I followed him, and for the first time in a long time I noticed the yard. The fence was tall and sturdy, but in one place a tree branch stretched through it. It seemed like a possible escape route. Buster, as if realizing my plan, was waiting patiently for me on the other side of the fence. I painfully climbed over the fence, feeling weakness and exhaustion grip my body. As soon as I reached the ground, Buster suddenly rushed forward and disappeared over the hill. I ran after him, although the steep slope required a lot of effort. As I was climbing, I suddenly touched something soft. Surprised, I looked up and saw a carpet. It was impossible. I was standing on the second floor of my house. Looking down, I saw the stairs leading to the living room. My mind seemed to freeze. How did I get here? Where is Buster? I fell to my knees, tired and desperate, and just sat on the landing, calling out to the dog from time to time. But there was no response. The silence was broken only by the ringing of the phone in the kitchen. I jumped up as if it was a distress call. I ran down the stairs and grabbed the phone. The warm voice of my wife on the other end of the line filled me with hope. She was concerned that she hadn't heard from me for a long time. "Honey, are you okay? I haven't heard from you at work for a week," she said. I froze. "What do you mean? I was given a week of vacation. I'm resting," she answered carefully. "Darling, you were supposed to start working as soon as you arrived. I thought you would be back a few days ago. How long have I been here?" I asked. "You disappeared 9 days ago," she replied, her voice trembling with concern. My heart clenched. 9 days? Everything I remembered seemed like one long day. Realizing that something incomprehensible was happening, I told my wife. "Listen, you have to call the police. Something is wrong. Maybe it's a gas leak or something with my health." My words were just an excuse to avoid further questions. But I began to realize that maybe it was true. If it was gas or a tumor or something like that, it would even be a relief. Any rational explanation seemed better than living in a haunted house. My wife spoke again, but her voice was distant and alien, filled with mockery. "What's wrong, dear? Why don't you say anything? Isn't it time to give up?" Her words seemed to roll through my mind, making me doubt the reality of what I was hearing. But I couldn't allow myself to be distracted. After all, something was outside the bedroom door, and its presence was undeniable. I picked up my frying pan, ready for what would happen next. But when the door opened, there was no one inside. Only a long, thick trail of blood leading to the wall. The wall, which in a moment began to move. It seemed to be breathing, swaying and pulsating, emitting a barely audible moan. Sweat trickled down my face as I took a step forward, still holding the frying pan in front of me. Buster howled weakly, and I heard him whimper softly behind me. His weakness only spurred me on. "Hey!" I shouted into the empty room. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but this ends here and now." There was no response, only a sound like an exasperated sigh coming from the wall. I swung the frying pan and hit the wall, which seemed soft to the touch, almost alive. The impact created a deep crack, and blood began to drip from the wall like a wound. "Is that all you can do?" I said again, although my knees were shaking. The wall started to split even more, and something thick and dark came out of it. I took another hit, and the room shook as if from an earthquake. I heard a roar and saw a hand appear, made of intertwined veins and a dark substance. It reached for me, but I jumped away, dodging it. "Buster, run!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure if he could. But Buster, full of amazing determination, began to move toward the exit, limping but with some animal strength. He passed me by, his wet footprints leaving a faint imprint on the floor. Meanwhile, I made one last stroke with the frying pan, and my hand retreated, reaching back into the crack. Something screamed loudly, as if in agony, and the wall stopped moving. Everything was quiet. The walls were calm, but the trail of blood and the gaping crack remained, reminding me of what had just happened. I ran to Buster, picked him up, and hurried to the exit. The glass door, which had once opened so easily, now seemed to resist, but I opened it anyway. We rushed out of breath and exhausted. I never looked back at the house again. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible, as quickly as possible. But even when Buster and I reached the road and stopped at the first car we saw, my heart was burdened with the weight of what I had left behind. I would never return to that house again. But whatever it was more than just a broken mind or a hallucination. And I knew that even if I escaped, the shadow of this place would always be with me. My screams broke the oppressive silence, but even they seemed empty and useless in this place. I felt as if the walls of the house were watching me, as if the whole building was a living organism feeding on my despair. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't stop. Everything around me was becoming even more bizarre and senseless. I tried to make myself believe that it was just a dream. No, it was a terrible nightmare, and I just had to wake up. But nothing changed. The furniture in the living room was still in its place, just like before. The carpet was clean, as if nothing had ever happened here. But I knew the truth. The blood, the knife, Buster, the cop, it was all real. "What do you want from me?" I screamed at the empty house, waving my arms. "Why can't you just let me go?" There was no answer. Only a slight sound of wind that sounded like a sigh. I knelt down, breathing heavily. Then I felt a cold breeze pass along my neck, making me shiver. It was as if something invisible was looking right at me. I couldn't stay here any longer. I got to my feet, steeling myself, and moved toward the door. It was closed, although I had seen it open a few minutes ago. I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Again. "No, no, no, please," I begged, pulling the door with all my strength. My body was trembling, and my eyes began to go dark. I had no strength to fight. I knew that this house would not let me go so easily. But suddenly I felt the door give way, as if someone on the other side had turned the lock. I stepped back a step, not believing my eyes as the door slowly opened on its own. Sunlight poured in through the threshold. I took a timid step forward, then another, until I was outside the house. My feet touched the ground, and I breathed in the fresh air. I was still expecting a trap, but nothing happened. I looked around. The house looked the same as always, but now it seemed smaller, almost tiny, compared to the immense terrifying force that lived inside. I no longer hesitated. I went to the car and got behind the wheel again. This time I was determined. My fear gave way to a fierce will to live. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas. The road stretched out before me, long and straight. This time I was sure I was going to make it. But in the rearview mirror, I saw a house. It did not shrink, did not disappear. It seemed to be everywhere, following me like a tethered weight. And then, as if in mockery, a familiar female voice sounded barely audible. "You will never escape." I pressed harder on the gas, not looking back. The laptop screen flickered as if trying to keep my attention, but I couldn't take it anymore. The keys under my fingers felt alien, almost like enemies. Every word, every letter seemed like hammer blows that pierced me through. I was losing touch with myself, with my reality. Exhausted, I looked up from the screen. The air in the office became thick, pressing like underwater pressure. I could hear whispers, faint, barely perceptible, but growing louder. The voices merged into one obsessive note, asking, demanding that I finish. I looked at the screen again. The message had changed. It was simple, unadorned. "End your pain." My heart pounded and cold sweat covered my body. I instinctively threw the laptop away, but it remained in place as if glued. The message changed again. "You don't remember anything else. You have nothing more. Put an end to it." My hand, as if on cue, reached for the knife that lay on the edge of the table. Its cold metal was heavy, almost familiar. I closed my eyes and began to remember. Buster. The policeman. The house. The hands that trembled with fear and despair. Was Buster real? Was I real? The whispers in the room became screams, voices coming from the walls, from the floor, from inside my skull. They were all saying the same thing. Stop it. I opened my eyes again and saw that the knife was on the floor at my feet. I felt light in my hands, as if something had finally let go of me. I took a deep breath and looked around. The office was empty, faceless. No voices. Not a single noise. I decided to act. Throwing the laptop aside, I left the office, heading for the front door. It was closed, but not locked. I turned the handle, pushed it open, and stepped outside. Fresh air hit me in the face like a salvation. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I looked back at the house. Now it seemed old and empty, a powerless shadow of what had terrorized me. I kept walking. Each step took me further away from the horrors that had happened. My mind was devastated, but my heart was beating harder. I didn't know if I would be able to remember my past, or recover who I was, but I knew one thing: I was alive. And I was no longer in that house. Far away on the horizon, a light appeared. A car. Help. I stopped and turned to the house one last time. It stood silent, its windows looking at me like empty eyes. And then, it began to dissolve in the twilight, disappearing as if it had never existed. I returned to the road and continued on my way. Cursed Tales. Trash horror stories. Subscribe for a scream.